Great interest tonight, of course, is the foreign policy of Japan, and most specifically, its international economic policy. And to deal with that, we're extraordinarily fortunate to have with us the ambassador of that great nation. Ambassador Matsunaga is a graduate of the University of Tokyo School of Law, and in 1945 passed the higher civil service examination. His career in the Foreign Ministry has been marked by 3 assignments in the Treaties Bureau, and he rose to become Director General of that particular bureau. He has also been Director of Personnel in the Foreign Ministry, and he was posted both in France and in Mexico, serving as his country's ambassador to that nation in 1978 to 1981. He has also served in the Foreign Ministry as Deputy Vice Minister, Deputy Minister, and Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, before being appointed to his present position in 1985, Ambassador to the United States. It's my great privilege and honor to be able to present to you His Excellency Nobuo Matsunaga, Ambassador of Japan to the United States. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Bhatt, for your warm introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very much privileged to have given this opportunity to speak before this very prestigious audience. And I would like to express, first of all, my strong feeling of gratitude to the Council on Foreign Affairs of Baltimore to have invited me. I have been looking forward to this opportunity to meet with the officers, members, and the guests of this young and vigorous organization. I have been deeply impressed by the diversity and scale of your activities, reaching out to the business sector, the schools, and the community at large. In this age of the global community, the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs is performing the vitally important task of informing and involving the leadership and the general public of this city in responsible international citizenship. I am very much honored to participate in your distinguished speakers program. The city of Baltimore has a long and illustrious history as one of the world's great seaports. International commerce has long been the lifeblood of industry in this city and state, a role that is exemplified by this magnificent World Trade Center and its modern waterfront facilities. It is appropriate, therefore, that I report to you this evening on current trade and future prospects for our mutually beneficial political and economic partnership, an alliance that binds the people of the United States and Japan together in friendship and shared purposes. When I met my good friend and your great ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, before I left Tokyo to join my post in Washington, he sympathized by saying, "You are jumping from the frying pan into the fire." Right, he was. You can imagine that on the second day after my arrival in Washington, D.C., I had to face the Senate resolution that famous resolution calling for retaliation against Japan, which was passed by 92-0 in the Senate. Ever since, I have been taking quite a bit of heat on trade matters. However, as one of my hobbies is cooking, I can assure you that I have no intention at all of getting out of my kitchen. More seriously, in the year and a half since I took up my present post in Washington, I have seen ample evidence of the enduring strength of our global partnership. Our two governments are in close daily consultation on a wide range of economic, political, and security issues of common concern. To a remarkable degree, we share similar interests and are working toward compatible goals as democratic societies and as the world's two leading industrial powers and largest trading nations. The very large imbalance in our two-way trade has been one of the few sources of stress in this extremely close and mutually beneficial relationship. Last year, the imbalance was close to $50 billion in Japan's favor, and the United States deficit will probably be undoubtedly larger this year. This is a very unhealthy situation, and we Japanese fully share the concerns of our American friends. The leaders of both countries are working diligently to correct it, and both countries are making very important progress. But the problem is not yet solved. The greatest danger we face is the temptation to try a quick fix of protectionism that could only make the problem worse. It was good to learn that the protectionist trade bill, which the House had passed, was not approved by the Senate in the last session of the Congress. And we are very much encouraged by that. Had that bill become law, it would have been a grave setback for the free and open trading system of the world. Certainly, we could not move toward freer and expanding world trade if the United States, by far the world's largest trading nation, were moving in the opposite direction of protectionism. It seems to me that the world economy is at a crossroads. Our government have charted an enlightened course toward free world trade to be based on agreed and enforceable GATT rules. At the same time, however, large trade imbalances continue to feed political pressures in this country for protectionist legislation that would move us in the opposition direction, down a dangerous path that the world traveled in the 1930s. The large U.S. trade deficit with Japan, and incidentally with most of the rest of the world, is clearly an unhealthy situation. It distorts the U.S. international payments position. It has helped transform the United States into the world's largest debtor nation, and it threatens to undermine the healthy expansion of the U.S. economy. Trade imbalances will not be corrected, however, by limiting U.S. imports or by punishing trade partners of the United States. Equilibrium will be restored to international trade only when we address the actual causes of trade distortions. First, recent United States trade deficits are not exclusively a Japanese problem, although this is the way the situation is very often described by the protectionists. Since 1981, United States trade deficit with Japan and the European community have increased by about the same amount, some $31 billion. During those same 5 years, U.S. trade deteriorated from surplus into deficit with Latin America by $19 billion, with the newly industrializing countries of Pacific Asia by $18 billion, and with Canada by $15 billion. U.S. exports to the world face fewer trade barriers today than 5 years ago, and yet its exports to the rest of the world have declined by $20.6 billion. In this connection, it is to be noted that over the same 5-year period, U.S. exports to Japan managed to increase by $808 million, while its exports dropped by $6.6 billion vis-à-vis the EEC countries. Japan has, during the past 5 years, initiated a series of measures to improve access to its market. Tariffs on more than 80% of dutiable items have been slashed or eliminated. Import procedures and paperwork have been streamlined. Simplified new import standards have been designed to accommodate the interests of foreign manufacturers. Our authorities now accept certification from U.S. and other foreign certifying organizations. During the past year, in the so-called MOS talks with the U.S. trade officials, specific improvements in market access were achieved in 4 industrial sectors very important to the United States, namely forest products, medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, electronics, and telecommunications. As a primary beneficiary of an open free trading system, Japan considers it as its special obligation to make the Japanese market one of the most open and accessible in the world. An OECD study a year ago confirmed that we are very near that goal, and I can assure you that we intend to continue in this direction. On the other hand, there is a growing consensus among economists and other experts on both the causes of and the remedies for current distortions in trade flows and payment balances. For instance, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York made constructive contribution in a scholarly study published this spring in the bank's quarter review. According to Fitch, about 1/5 of the increase in the U.S. trade deficit with Japan was due to macroeconomic factors such as changes in currency exchange rates and relative patterns of real growth of prices in the two countries. During this period, the study points out, the U.S. economy and U.S. domestic demand grew faster than in most other countries, and the dollar appreciated against most other currencies, especially against the yen. At the same time, economic growth and domestic demand were depressed in a number of third world countries because of accumulated foreign debt and depressed world prices for a number of basic commodities that these countries were exporting. As a result of these macroeconomic trends, U.S. imports grew much faster than world imports, and the market for U.S. exports stagnated and in some cases actually declined. During the same 5 years, Japan was almost a mirror image of the U.S. economy. Japan's domestic demand grew very slowly, but Japan's exports benefited greatly from the overvalued dollar and the high growth in U.S. import demand. As Secretary of State Schultz pointed out back in April last year in his Princeton address, there is one more cause for our huge trade imbalance, namely the imbalance between savings and investment both in the United States and Japan. United States savings are very low compared to investment, and this shows up as a large external trade surplus. Both countries, the United States savings are very low compared to investment, whereas in Japan, the trend is accurately opposite, where savings are extremely high compared with investment. And this shows up as a large external trade imbalance. Therefore, both countries need to take a close look at these macroeconomic structure factors. I am very much pleased to see that our two governments are now holding the first official sub-cabinet level meeting in Washington in order to look into these factors. Meanwhile, my government is beginning to implement recommendations of a private sector commission which called for a structural adjustment in the Japanese economy that will stimulate domestic demand, including import demand, and reduce dependence on exports. In this regard, the Japanese government announced last month a package of measures to stimulate domestic demand amounting to more than $23 billion. They are expected to bring about a positive impact on the Japanese economy equivalent to 1.5% of the annual GNP. A cabinet-level office has also been established to promote the expansion of private consumption and housing construction, which will together amount to about 60% of GNP. Our objective over the medium and long term is to transform our industrial structure so that it is in harmony with a more rational international division of labor. It is our earnest hope that at the same time the United States will also address its own problems of macroeconomic structure. We applaud the steps taken so far by the administration and Congress to reduce the federal budget deficit, and we do hope that those efforts will be successful. We have, in other words, been making progress in addressing the fundamental macroeconomic causes of trade distortions. One of the most important achievements of the past year, I believe, is our progress in currency realignment. Since September a year ago, the major monetary powers have accomplished a substantial depreciation of the dollar against other currencies, particularly the yen. The yen has now appreciated by more than 40% in relation to the dollar. As a consequence, American exporters can now sell their goods in the Japanese market at much lower yen prices with no less in dollar income. Currency realignment is already having an impact on Japan's trade. During the first half of this year, the yen value of Japanese exports to the United States was down 13% from the same period in the previous year, although the dollar value was still rising, a temporary phenomenon economists call the J-curve effect. Over the next few months, however, we anticipate that the Japanese exports become less price competitive. They will decline as they become less price competitive. They will decline in dollar value. Furthermore, the effect of the currency realignment on our bilateral trade imbalance will be far larger than you might imagine. For instance, Japanese companies which have been making profit out of exporting will have to turn more to the importing business as an equally important source of profit. Or those Japanese manufacturers who have been dependent on parts and components from domestic suppliers will increasingly look for cheaper foreign suppliers. Japanese direct investment to the United States are also expected to take place at an accelerated pace. Incidentally, the effects of currency realignment are already showing in Japan's trade with the rest of the world. During the first half of this year, Japan's imports from the European community rose 40% in dollar value compared with the previous year. On the other hand, U.S. exports to Japan are growing at a much more modest rate. I do hope that American exporters will take full advantage of the opportunities created through the yen's drastic appreciation and liberalization measures. I believe more remains to be done on both sides. We have agreed to extend our most talks into the transportation machinery sector. In the sensitive area of leather and leather footwear, we have significantly improved market access by reducing tariffs. We have taken the initiative to expand the market for American semiconductors and to forestall dumping of Japanese semiconductors in the U.S. market. We are also going to reduce to zero from 20% of tariffs levied on imported cigarettes. We do hope that the United States side will take full advantage of the double blessing of enhanced access to Japanese markets and of the low dollar situation. On the multilateral front, the success of the recent Punta del Este conference on the new round of GATT was a reflection in no small measure of Japanese-American teamwork. I am just as confident that the success of worldwide trade negotiations during the next several years will require the same close cooperation between our two governments. As the world's two largest and most productive market economies and allies, we share both the opportunity and the responsibility to resist protectionist pressures, discourage new barriers to trade, and remove existing barriers to the movement of goods, capital, and services, while strengthening the GATT as a universal discipline for expanding trade and promoting global economic development. Here ends my prepared text of speech. And now, before concluding, let me express to you very frankly what I am feeling about the present stage of trade relations and our bilateral relationship as a whole between the two nations. As I said in my remarks, I have arrived here in the United States at a rather difficult moment. And since I am here, I have been constantly facing very strong pressure of protectionism and heat of frustrations against Japan. I have been hearing almost all the time, Japan is closed, Japan is unfair. And facing this situation, I have been doing with my government my utmost efforts in order to correct the perception here in the United States that Japan is closed or Japan is unfair. And we have been, I believe, making rather strenuous efforts in order to remove tariff and non-tariff barriers. And this is being done not for the interests of our American friends, but our own interests. Japan, which has reached a rather high level of economic development, is now becoming aware of our international responsibility. And we have to cope with our international obligation, under which we believe it is our supreme obligation to open further our market to the world trade. We have no other option, and we were moving ahead in that direction in coming years. But at the same time, when we look into the trade imbalance problem, we find that trade relations are not mere accumulation of business transactions. And we do feel very strongly that opening up of market could be one of the means to resolve our problems which we are facing today, but that is not only the means. The problem today is that we cannot find a single and absolute key for trade imbalance solution. There are a number of things that Japan has to do in addition to the opening up measures of market. As I stated in my remarks, we are now endeavoring to secure our own economic growth through expansion of domestic demand. It is true that in the past, we have been developing our economy depending heavily on the exports. But we realize we have reached the level of development beyond which we can no more expect to depend on exports to secure our economic growth. And that is why my government is now making its maximum efforts to expand domestic demand, because we know that to keep our economic growth in steady form will contribute to the vitalization of world economy. We are also encouraging our direct investments abroad, which would have a very constructive and positive effect to balance trade imbalance problem. And we are very happy to see very substantial increase in our investment, direct investments going out from Japan, including the United States. We are also aware of our responsibility to increase our ODA, that is to say, Foreign Assistance Program. And it is in that light that my government made a commitment to double our ODA assistance in 7 years to come. In 7 years, our ODA will reach a level of $40 billion, which is comparable to the United States foreign assistance. We are also making our efforts in order to contribute to resolve the problem of accumulated debts. I believe very strongly that accumulated debts is one of the most serious causes which are distorting our trade relations. Therefore, it is our responsibilities, it is our duty that Japan should contribute positively in to contribute to resolve the accumulated debt problem, particularly of the developing countries. To cooperate with the United States in GATT new round negotiations, as I stated, is another thing which we have to do. currency alignment is also one very important aspect of our efforts. But in addition to all those measures or efforts which I have just enumerated, we have to look into the macroeconomic structure of trade programs. And there we find that we are responsible, Japanese are responsible to reform our economic structure. However, we do feel also that our trading partners, including the United States, have their own problems to overcome. It is often cited by economists that you have a very serious problem of budget deficit, which is causing distortion in interest rates and exchange rates. You have also your own structural problem for your industries. I think it is becoming more and more clear that we all together need to concentrate our efforts. I think it is very reasonable to say that the trade problem which we are facing today cannot be resolved unless we could coordinate and combine our joint efforts. We do appreciate very highly that United States administration is taking very firm position against protectionism. And we do believe that Japan has to support that position. And that is the reason, one of the reasons why we are making our efforts, which I just described. As a diplomat, I am optimistic for our future. When we look into the future of Pacific region and Asia, we clearly see there enormous potentiality that this region will become one of the most important centers of world affairs in the next century. I think that is a historical trend when we view the geographic situation, the natural and human resources, and the dynamism contained in that region. The stability and the prosperity of this region will highly depend on how successfully Japan and the United States could combine their cooperative efforts. Japan is a country which shares with the United States the same value of freedom and democracy. We have been, and we will continue to be, most reliable of the United States, reliable ally of the United States. I am quite confident that the problems which we are facing today, although they are extremely difficult and sometimes very complicated, our joint and cooperative efforts would allow us to have brighter tomorrow than today. And I would like to assure all of you that I will spare none of my efforts in order to promote further our cooperative relationship. And therefore, I would like to urge to all of you to extend me your support and also your advice in case of necessity, for which I would be most gratified. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, to thank you for a comprehensive statement would be an understatement, I think. I trust that not all the questions have been anticipated. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ambassador, do you see a threat to the culture of Japan in these pressures from the West for you to have larger houses, consume more things, give up rice self-sufficiency, and reduce your domestic spending from an average of 17%? And might this lead to social problems for Japan down the road, which might have an impact on the whole West?
As is our norm, I'll repeat the questions for the benefit of our television cameras. The question was, will the internal adjustments in Japan, which you referred to, which will be undertaken for the purpose of assisting the amelioration of the problems of the United States and other countries, lead to some pressures within Japan which could be detrimental socially?
Well, I would say that is undoubtedly the direction in which we are moving ahead. It might take some time. We might be encountered by some difficulties in internal or domestic affairs, but we do feel strongly that there is no other choice. If Japan is going to live in harmony with the international community, and that is precisely that objective, having in mind that my government is now starting the program for structural reform of Japanese economy. And there could be the problems which would take some time. And, but I do feel that we Japanese will be facing that problem, and we have to resolve that problem on our own responsibility. As to the culture which you have mentioned, Japan has been, I believe, successful enough to combine our culture, which has a very long historical tradition. We have been successful to harmonize our old culture with modern life. And I'm quite confident that although we might have some difficulties, we would be able to overcome.
Mr. Rich?
Mr. Ambassador, it was very interesting during your formal presentation. I heard the word free a minimum of 3 times, probably more, but the co-equal and more important word, fair, I never heard once. And I'll give you high marks for that, because I got to considering it during your talk, and I take it, you frankly don't think it's fair, and I wouldn't use the word. So congratulations on that. One thing is the problem with the United States that's really bugging me is in the pharmaceuticals. I had this within the last 10 days, perhaps you heard the same thing. This company went through our FDA, which is a long, tough process. Sold in the United States, sold throughout the West. Then they came to Japan on invitation. They came over there, and then the ball game rules are horrendous. They have to then go through Japanese laboratories, Japanese scientists, technicians, mice, a whole 5-year program. They do it. And then finally the Japanese hit the market with this product, and then give the Americans who brought it into you about 60 days later the go-ahead sign to go into the market. And so you're by background law, isn't there the copyright and that type of thing that's recognized in Japan? Because I think in your talk at the end, informally here, I think you were excellent. I understand what you're telling us. But this one angle I hadn't heard before, and I'd like to hear your explanation on how they could do that. Take the manufacturer's product, feed them to the Japanese market, after 5 years?
It's a long question, Mr. Ambassador. I think the theme was the assertion that perhaps, and you've heard this before, that the Japanese are not being fair in allowing competitive goods into their country. And the specific example which was given dealt with the pharmaceutical industry, and the suggestion was made that a series of barriers were created, A, and then B, the product learned about was then marketed in competition with the product which was attempted to be sold within the country. Would you comment upon the specific situation and the general charge of unfairness?
Thank you very much for your comment. I think your comments refer rather to the problem of certification and standard. And it is true that in the past, Japan maintained its own standard and its own procedure for certification, which took for the imported products an enormous time and very complicated procedures, and which were very often criticized as barriers of trade. But in case of pharmaceuticals, through the most talks which I have referred to in my remarks, we arrived to the conclusion to simplify those procedures and also to adopt foreign standards to be admitted for the import of pharmaceuticals. And therefore, I do not believe that today, and this simplification of procedures and the adoption of foreign standards have been introduced only quite recently. And therefore, I do not believe that these are now still formulating some barrier for foreign imports. However, if there is any specific cases or specific problem, I would be very much delighted to hear such case and to find out what I can do to resolve the problem. And so please do not hesitate to come up either to the embassy in Washington or to any consulate general's office in the regions, or you may also address directly to my government in Tokyo, and we will make all of our efforts in order to find out a satisfactory solution for that.
You didn't address whether or not you have copyright laws. How could they take that?
We have copyright law.
You apparently don't go abide by it then.
Well, Japan is the contracting party of the Copyright Convention, and I believe that Japan is implementing the international convention very faithfully, and we have our own law for the protection of copyrights. And so if there is any cases which you want me to clarify, please don't hesitate to bring it to me.
Mr. Roper?
Ambassador, in the Forbes magazine on November the 3rd, which is currently on the newsstands, there's a lead article concerning Japan's trade with Cuba, which in 1986 will amount to approximately $850 million. I'm curious to hear what your comments would be about this.
The request is simply for you to comment upon upon Japan's trade with Cuba, and perhaps on the content of the Forbes article, if indeed you happen to see it.
I haven't read that article which you have referred to, but for the relations or foreign policy, as you know, every country has its own relations and its own policy towards any other particular country. And we have with Cuba diplomatic relations as well as some economic relations. But I would like to stress that our trade relations with Cuba is extremely limited, and we are refraining to expand our trade relations with that country. And I do not believe that our trade relations with Cuba would have deteriorative effect on the United States foreign policy.
Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Ambassador, before asking a question, for those of us that have had the privilege to travel to Japan, we thank your people, your children, your women, your men, for their gracious hospitality and for the very lovely visit that so many of us have had in Japan. Now I would like to ask a question. The Japanese are major buyers of U.S. government bonds. Under what conditions, Mr. Ambassador, would you concede that the Japanese would no longer continue to buy U.S. government bonds?
The question is, under what conditions, Mr. Ambassador, might the Japanese government cease to buy American bonds, government bonds?
That is a very difficult question to respond, I think. Because for the purchase of bonds or outflow of capital from Japan to United States or to United States security markets are following the principle of free marketing principle, and that depends on market forces. I would presume that the purchase or sales are being made. Are you suggesting that the government should intervene in those marketing?
No. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, I realize that the position that you express is Mr. Nakasoni's government position. However, in some of the readings that I've done, particularly Mr. Matsushita's magazine, some articles that included the shipbuilders and steel makers, ISI, Mitsubishi. There's a very strong internal resistance to that government position. How does Mr. Nakasone and the government expect to counter the people that these people control in the dining?
Well,
Excuse me. The question is, there may be the premise of the question is that there may be a tension between Mr. Nakasone's policies and the policies in which some of the people participating in the Japanese economy might be interested in. The question is, how does Mr. Nakasone attempt to deal with these pressures against his policies?
Well, I believe in general Prime Minister Nakasone's policy is supported by consensus in Japan. There might be some people or some sectors which will be against such reform. But you have mentioned to Nippon Steel and Matsushita. I do not know what are the positions of those industries. But what I can say is that by the currency realignment, which I have referred to, it is true that the shipbuilding industries as well as steel industries are receiving a very serious hit. And it is true that these industries are even screaming. And they are very much afraid of that if this trend continues, that is to say, yen would be further appreciated. That would cause very serious setback for Japanese national economy itself. and to a certain extent, their concern is understandable. And as I said at the beginning, one of our very important responsibilities is to secure our healthy economic growth. And therefore, the policies and the programs which will be introduced in order to bring about the structural reform of Japanese economy itself must be adjusted and coordinated so that it would not prevent the healthy growth of Japanese economy. And as to the eventual oppositions or resentment, as I said, there could be some difficulties in our internal affairs. But I am quite confident that if we look from a little bit longer term of time of the period, we will be able to overcome these problems.
Yes. Mr. Ambassador, I understand that your country has purchased about $2 billion worth of real estate along the West Coast and the East Coast, and also approximately $2 billion worth of gold to cut down on the deficit. Do you believe that your country will continue to do this, and would they go into the banking industry, say if Chase Manhattan went up for sale? Do you think your banking...
I think the question is, how much of the United States is Japan willing to buy?
Well, I have to say that it is not the Japanese government which is making such purchases. And I think that kind of business transactions are carried out according to the principle of free marketing principle. And we have to let the market forces to decide. I have to add that many people in the world believe that Japan is rich, so the government of Japan is also rich. But the Japanese government is extremely poor. And I am receiving every year the reduction of for the expenses for running my embassy in Washington, which is a big headache for myself. But nevertheless, to sell or to purchase those kind of business transactions, if they are carried out in violation of laws and regulations which are in force, then that is very serious thing which we have to look into the matter as government. But as far as they are made and carried out perfectly in accordance with laws and regulations which are in force in that country, I think there is very small room for the government to intervene. And as I said, I understand that these transactions are made in accordance with the principle of free economic trade and free marketing principle.
Could you please comment on the perception that the U.S. picks up the bill for Japan's defense needs and therefore takes off that economic burden off their shoulders?
Would you comment upon the possibility of Japan bearing more of the defense burden and thus helping the United States?
First of all, let me say that in the defense field, we have very good, constructive and positive cooperative relationship between Japan and the United States. And we understand that the United States administration is taking the position to appreciate our efforts to strengthen our defensive capabilities. Japan, which is faced in the east part of Asia, is facing very difficult and to some extent dangerous situation in terms of security. We know how the Soviets are building up their military strengths in the regions surrounding Japan and Pacific area. And facing that situation, we are quite aware of the necessity to improve our defensive capabilities, which will, in the long run, will contribute to the strengthening of the security measures in the Pacific region as a whole. At the same time, we believe that our strengthening of our defense capabilities should be realistic, and it is under that circumstances that my government has decided a year ago a new 5-year plan for strengthening of our defense forces, and we are implementing very faithfully that 5-year plan. And I know that the United States government is appreciating it very much.
Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate very much your coming here to Baltimore and sharing your valuable time with us. Our respect for the thoroughness and competence of the Japanese people remains undiminished. We are thoroughly appreciative of the spirit of your remarks. We all hope, I know, that indeed these trade problems which you refer to can be worked out amicably, and I know we appreciate the genuineness of your remarks with respect to that resolution. It's been very good of you to come here this evening. We thank you.
I thank you very much.
Very good. You did a very well. Peter,